Hi. Um, it's Friday. Um, for some of you that celebrate Easter, this is a solemn day. I remember growing up in the Catholic Church, and we would have to be quiet from 12 to 3. And I know some of you might be honoring Passover. Not sure about you, but I'm a little sad today not being connected with my family, not being able to go and celebrate or mark Easter. So anyway, so here we are, and of all things, I'm going to talk about child, older adult, and intimate partner abuse. It's the next topic in the syllabus that we're doing together. So we're going to talk about abuse, violence toward others, and it's pretty contagious and public health piece now in our country. And it's funny, when I talked to one of my other daughters this past couple of weeks, they were saying, like, Mom, it's going to be tough on families who are living in a violent family situation where people don't get along and where there's emotional, physical abuse. And this definitely puts more of a strain on families. So just to keep that in mind in terms of public health. So types of abuse, we're talking about almost anything. Like physical is obvious, sexual is obvious, we have so much of that. Then emotional abuse, we not always considering that. Neglect and economic abuse. People trying to live on a very small amount of money, and perhaps they're legally separated or divorced, and there's a little money coming into the primary family now. So I think too, neglect, and I'm sure in your practice, no matter where you are, you've been aware of that, where people are neglected. We can certainly see that with young children and the elderly. We see that a lot with the elderly. If you've ever done home care, you can go in and see how some people live, even when they're living with their children. So sexual abuse, our culture unfortunately has large incidents of sexual abuse, and then physical abuse. And we would mostly see that with children and women who are being battered by their partner, spouse. So interestingly, and I'm using the Blackboard slides if you want to look along, half of all Americans have experienced violence in their family. That's just amazing to me. It really reflects on our values and culture, and also the disparity in opportunities that people have. I mean, we're seeing that with COVID-19, where a large proportion of Black folks are getting ill and perishing from this epidemic. So the comorbidity of violence, certainly, and this is no surprise to you because you've heard this so many times from me: anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, or PTSD. So in order for there to be an occurrence of violence, other than a cultural piece where people are really being mistreated by systems, federal government, state and local government, you have to have a perpetrator. And that's the person that's inflicting that kind of violence or abuse. You need someone who is pretty much vulnerable, and we've probably all found ourselves in those places where we're more vulnerable. And certainly there's some crisis situation or it might be everyday pieces of life that the perpetrator focuses on with his victim. And I guess I shouldn't say victim. Did I just say victim? No, vulnerable person. So I think the use of the word victim really implies a lot. Like, you know, there's an inability, or somehow you didn't get away from it, or whatever. So, you know, I think it's important to look at our language. So the perpetrator, and you may know someone, and this might describe that person, and it can be a man or a woman, adolescent, young adult. So the perpetrator typically sees their needs as more important than most others. That person's controlling. That person most usually has poor social skills, or if they do have social skills, they're kind of masquerading in those skills when underneath they're really not a very kind person. They have poor coping skills, and you'll see perpetrators in particular using drugs, alcohol, you know, to kind of calm their nerves or whatever. And then certainly are abusive as a way of coping. You know, it's kick the dog kind of syndrome, not tolerating other people's feelings. Extreme pathological jealousy of someone. Women often complain about this, you know, well, I had to give up seeing a lot of my girlfriends because, wow, he would get so upset and call me, and what do you mean you're going out again? And the same is true for a man, young man whose girlfriend, spouse, partner is so controlling and demanding and just really does not want that person hanging out with anyone else or having feelings about that other person. Friends, co-workers can be very jealous with among friends and also with co-workers. So you'll see some of that in terms of a perpetrator. So I've got some pictures on here. They're pretty alarming. Again, you know, it's like not pointing the finger at men necessarily, but women certainly can be violent, and certainly can oftentimes be violent towards their children and abusive. It's not unusual, let's put it that way, for a mother, woman caregiver, female caregiver to be abusive. So what are the characteristics of that vulnerable person then? You know, why is that person particularly vulnerable to someone who's abusive? And, you know, it's a kind of tough topic to talk about, and you might find that as you're listening to me, because many of us might have been in a situation that we are in a really not good relationship, or our parents were neglectful, emotionally abusive, telling us we're stupid or we're never going to amount to anything, or how come you don't get all A's? What is wrong with you? Maybe pointing out some physical flaws that you have and laughing or making fun of you. You know, there's a lot of different ways that we can be really mean to each other. And I think, you know, what you want to look at is patterns. Like, you know, we all have these moments when we're not kind. You know, we don't think about the best way to express ourselves or react to things. So this is more or less a pattern of behavior. So some of the pieces that can trigger vulnerability, especially for women, is pregnancy. And here's a piece where the perpetrator might be very jealous of the forming baby, the new baby. And that often can trigger or even increase violence toward a woman. Violence escalates when that person, the spouse, the partner, the lover, whoever, makes a move toward independence. This is where, again, you'll see the controlling and abusive behaviors of the perpetrator. And then the greatest risk for violence and death is when that person tries to leave the relationship, which is why we have shelters for women and children that remain secret to people, so that the perpetrator can't find that person. Unfortunately, people are very clever, and they can find a way of finding that person. And women, children are at great risk of being killed when that happens. So you got to remember that. You know, I remember when I first started working with women in particular who were being mistreated, it was always like, boy, why would you stay with someone like that? You know, and they would relate the kind of abuse they were, that was inflicted upon them. And being new at one point in my career, I could even get annoyed with them, like, well, we've talked about you not being, and so you've got to keep in mind how hard this is, how hard it is to leave, to get away from someone who's abusive. And you may know that. And you may know how hard that is. So when people resist our pleas or our observation that, wow, that's really not okay that that person treats you like that, you've got to be very patient. You just don't know what it's going to take for that person to leave. So we'll get to this in a minute, but you know, our piece is to keep pointing out how, wow, that's not okay that that person's treating you like that, or that you were treated like that, or you're treating your children like that. And then particularly with people who are very at risk for danger, helping them create a safety plan, where a safety exit plan. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but it often is like, start saving money, hide it somewhere, pack something, pack stuff for your children. And then when the time comes, you're going to be able to leave. So what about kids? I mean, what do they look like when they're most vulnerable? Well, many children, they're under 3. So they're depending on a caregiver, caretaker, parents, you know, relative, and they have very little ability to, I mean, they have no ability to defend themselves. They're absolutely at risk for being mistreated. So what are some of the reasons then that children may be mistreated? Now, it goes without saying, if someone's been mistreated, that cycle of violence continues, that they may mistreat their children if they were mistreated. So kids that are perceived as different are often mistreated. Kids that remind the parent of someone they don't like. You know, you've heard the story. He reminds me of his father. And I hated him. I couldn't wait to get away from him, or he divorced that son of a, you know what. And the kid reminds the person of the husband, and vice versa with abusive wife might remind the husband of that person, the children rather, sorry. Product of an unwanted pregnancy. Boy, you know, you just have to think about it for a minute. Like, were they ready? Is this something they wanted to do, to be a parent, to have a kid? And then anything that really interferes with the parent and child bonding. You know, you'll do maternal child next year, and what's so fascinating about that is that there is such a need for both parents to begin bonding. And there's a lot of studies that talk about, especially for the mother, that bonding begins even when the baby is in utero, that there is a sense of caring. Baby, and you know, Professor Day will probably talk about this, but babies have a sense of smell with the mother, even before they're born, which is pretty amazing. So children are unfortunately abused. They're bullied and abused often. And you know, again, this COVID-19, like a lot of the kids would have some means of being protected or get away from an abusive parent by going to school. And now there isn't that opportunity. We just heard about this teacher, and I don't know where she was, but she would visit her students once a week. She had many students and would bring them, you know, some paperwork they needed to do, and also would bring them some food. And the whole point being that she maintained a connection, and the kids knew that they would see her again every week and how important that was. So then with the older adult, we're talking about people that probably have some debilitation, who may be quite ill and frail. So poor mental or physical health, people that, you know, cognitively, they're really at risk for needing to be taken care of, maybe post-stroke or Huntington's or COPD, or, you know, maybe had some problems cognitively their whole life. An elderly person who's dependent on someone who's a perpetrator. Particularly at risk, I think here in Maine, and you know, I don't know whether it goes throughout our country, but female older than 75 years, white, living with a relative. They're especially at risk of being neglected, mistreated, financially. Somebody's taken their Social Security check or pension. And then, this is interesting, an elderly father who's being cared for by a daughter, and this father abused the daughter when she was a kid. We see that, and we're aware of that dynamic. I had a client who was terribly abused by both parents and ended up taking care of both parents. And I was always like, oh my God, I can't imagine having to care for these people who are so horrible to you. And her abuse was pretty remarkable, hard to hear. An elderly woman cared for by a husband, a partner who has abused her in the past, or maybe the woman cares for the husband and she has always been the abuser. See, you know, you just never know. You really have to discover what families are like. And of course, they can cover over things. So vulnerable people are also people in a minority oppressed by religion, oppressed by sexual orientation, gender identity. We're more and more aware of that, especially in this political time we're living in, you know, gay rights, transgender, people being discriminated against. They can be oppressed by fear, by hate, oppressed by political beliefs. People are not real great with each other right now in the context of all the politics that goes on. And oppressed by persons in power. And you know, you and I know what that's like. We know that piece. Controlling, powerful. So there's a cycle of violence, and I want you to particularly notice that, and you probably do know this. where there's tension building stage. And this is in, you know, the relationship of the perpetrator and the person that that perpetrator is harming. And then there's the acute battering stage. And, you know, I guess you could look at this physically, but you can also imagine, like, emotionally, just this barrage of horrible things being said to that person, to the point where, you know, they're dark inside. They don't feel good about themselves. And we can take that all in and start believing it ourselves. Then there's the honeymoon stage. And if you've ever been a part of it or observed anyone, it's like, oh, he didn't mean it. Oh, you know, he just got so angry and he was drinking beer. And, you know, every time he drinks beer and then the next day he apologized. Now I'm using he, but you can put the she in there. And came with, you know, the story, typical story, a bouquet of flowers, or wanted to take me out to dinner. You know, it's always this, oh, and then many of us think we can fix people, like, just, you know, treat him, her with kindness, and they'll come around, you know, they'll change the way they do things. And unfortunately, that doesn't happen that often. And then there's a cycle. It begins all over again. So the honeymoon, and then it gets to tension building. What do you mean you're going out? You just went out last week. What do you mean? You know, and that builds again, and then the whole cycle repeats. It gets very old. So nursing process assessment, you got to look physically and mentally. We have to look at everything going on there. You have to really think about where you're doing the interview. If the husband, for example, accompanies the wife to the ER or the kid, you got to get that perpetrator away from the person who's being mistreated in order for them to tell you things. And they might be very reluctant. Kids especially are told by the perpetrator of sexual abuse, you know, you tell anyone and I'm going to hurt your family, I'm going to hurt you, I'm going to, you know, blah, blah, blah. So somehow you need to be able to get that person away from the perpetrator. And you'll trust your intuitive gut kind of thing, like, whoa, I don't know how, yeah, that didn't seem right. Self-assessment. You really have to look at, you know, how am I, excuse me, I'm just fixing this cord. How am I feeling about this? I just want to go out and smack the person around. Of course, then I'm being abusive. And this is where you may get really angry or frustrated with your client, the person you're working with. Like, why do you go back? Why do you go back? I don't understand it. And I think unless you've been really mistreated, that piece probably can be pretty far away of understanding. But again, think about the consequences of that person trying to leave. And they know that. And they may have left before and been treated worse once that person found them. Assessments also include violence indicators, level of anxiety and coping responses, family coping patterns, support systems. Is that person being harmed suicidal or homicidal? Drug and alcohol abuse. I mean, again, you know, we just did substance, but boy, if life is that unpleasant, you can just imagine that person abusing substance. And, you know, and there we would be like, oh God, she gets drunk and he comes home and smacks her around. And I mean, you know, she's drunk. So, you know, we can still do that. We can be very, very judging, you know, and that's where your empathy comes in, trying to understand. So diagnosis, risk for injury, risk for violence. The goals are that you want that person to be protected from abuse, recovery from abuse, and we'll talk a lot about that when we do the next lecture on PTSD and DID, dissociative disorders. Talk about how people do try to recover. Guidelines for working with someone who's been mistreated or being mistreated. Nursing Network on Violence Against Women. And then again, we really need to come to grips with the amount of violence in our country and the amount of abuse in our country. You know, many of us may have been fortunate in growing up in families where, you know, our needs were met emotionally, physically, mentally. But we're not always the average person in our culture. The Me Too movement I put in here is another kind of movement that very promising in terms of finally confronting people who are especially sexually abusive, the Me Too movement. So you, as a healthcare person, are mandated to report abuse of elderly and children. Now, you're going to want to report adults, but there isn't that same mandate for you legally. But you do have to report. Here in Maine, you would report to the Department of Health and Human Services. So that's an intervention. I've worked with people who will come in and tell me stories about their sister who has tons of kids or few kids, and the boy child in the family is abusing the little girl. And they'll tell me that story, and it's like, all right, what do I do? I mean, you're telling me the story. I know who these people are. So what I've done in that case is with the sister who's my client, we call the department together and make the report. So it's a good way to role model, you know, what you do. And unfortunately, you'll get the follow-up. I know I followed up with my client shortly after, and they came and did a home visit and found no indication, even though the kid was like setting fires, which is a hallmark behavior of someone who's been really mistreated. Kids that do that or kill animals, like, oh my God, you know, this kid's been mistreated as well. Most likely sexually abused as well, and then they go on to become a perpetrator. So specific counseling, one-to-one, I did a lot of that in my practice. Group, safety plan, very big, plan it out. Okay, someday you're gonna decide you're gonna leave. That's it, something's gonna happen, and you're gonna wanna leave. And then case management, therapeutic environment, somewhere that they feel like you care about them, that you believe them, that they're safe with you. Promote healthcare, health teaching, promote self-care. So what about a safety plan? So it's amazing. So helping women, people who are mistreated, tell them about resources available. Even if that woman, you see her in the ED and she's going to go back with the perpetrator, giving her some information, maybe on a small piece of paper, about a number to call when she does decide to leave. So a safety plan is helping them know where to go, helping them get resources, because, you know, it's not like, dear, I'm going to leave you and I need some money. I mean, that isn't going to happen. So most of the time I would encourage people to hide their money somewhere and not leave it in a checking or savings account, but to somehow capture some money. Even that can be risky, but a lot of people were able to do that. And then to have resources available when you really need to get the heck out of there. Most often I tell them to pack a little bag for their children, because you're going to bring them with you. You're not leaving them there. And then, you know, the story goes, I worked with this woman over and over again. Her husband was drinking and using cocaine and very abusive, very poor skills. He had been mistreated himself, and was always like, you know, wow, this has got to be really hard staying and living with this person. Well, I love him, and, you know, I think I can help him treat me differently and the children. But he didn't. And he would get really drunk and rage and hurt her, and emotionally, physically. And she finally called me one day, and she wouldn't say where she was, and I didn't ask her, but she said, I left and I'm in a safe place. And I just wanted you to know, Jeannie. And so it's always good to ask. So what was it that caused you to leave? And she said, well, I was laying on the couch one evening and the kids were in bed. And he came over and just poured whatever he was drinking all over me. And that did it. So it's always interesting, you know, and I'm sure you in your life, it's like, well, when did you decide to make a change? You know, not necessarily around being mistreated, but when was it that it's like, that's it, I'm doing it, I'm not doing it? It's like a woman I saw who was an alcoholic, and she would go to her refrigerator and take out another beer. She'd go back, take out another beer. And she said one day she got up from her chair, went over, put her hand on the refrigerator door handle and said, oh my God, I need to stop doing this. And she went into recovery and was in recovery when I knew her. So I was like, that was it? She's like, yeah, that was it. So you'll know that you've helped someone if they are able to get into safe housing or a safe place and they haven't been injured. So again, what you're trying to do is really help people, your client, recognize an abusive relationship versus a non-abusive. And that's part of recovery. I mean, this person being mistreated may have been mistreated most of their life. It's like, oh, well, that's how my father treated me, or that's how my mother treated me. So this isn't any different, you know, and they have a high tolerance for being mistreated. So a lot of what you'll do when you work with someone like that is you'll validate or look at them and like, wow, you know, that's not okay that someone is treated like that. And they'll look at you like, really? No, that's not okay. That's not the way it's supposed to be in a relationship. So that's hard, and it takes time because it's looking at life in a different way. Prevention, primary prevention, measures taken to prevent the occurrence of abuse. Secondary would be early intervention in abusive situations to minimize disabling or long-term effects. So if we have a chance, you know, this is when you, in nursing, if you go into pediatrics or OB, or, you know, working with any of the children, that you see something that you want to act on. You don't want to wait like, oh, I think it was just that one time. You know, make sure that you understand it probably wasn't just that one time. Tertiary prevention is you're facilitating the healing and rehab process. You're providing support to that person. They're going to need you when they're out there. They go out there, they're alone, or maybe with their children. They don't have money. They're depending on this safe place where they can live right now. They need a lot of support. It's a lot of work coming out of that. And I have worked with people, especially women, who have gone back because it was so hard to do it on their own. And then to help survivors of violence to achieve their optimal level of safety, health, and well-being. I mean, that's what we always want to do in nursing, is help people get to their optimal level. So advanced practice interventions, and this is where, you know, I did my work: individual psychotherapy, family psychotherapy, group psychotherapy, family, if there's honest intent to change. Otherwise, you know, if you're intervening in a family and the perpetrator hears a lot in that therapy, the family members may be treated even more badly. That's such a word. So you have to be really careful. All right, then I have this one question at the end. Child abuse perpetrators are most often the kids' parents. Yeah. So very sad. All right, then there's I think it's the last slide. Yeah, on this PowerPoint. Leslie Morgensteiner, Why We Don't Leave. Oh, I wish I was with you when you could watch this. It's just remarkable. She is a lovely looking, wonderful speaker. I think worked for the New York Times. And she talks about her first marriage being with someone who was terribly abusive. And why didn't she leave when there were all these signs that this person would continue abusing her? So it's compelling, might be hard to watch. So, you know, maybe turn it off if it gets too close, too familiar for you. Maybe watch it with someone, talk with somebody about it. You can talk with me. Very happy to come online with you or chat with you. And I will have some questions from her video. I think it's like maybe 20 minutes. And it's just a remarkable TED Talk. She's just fabulous in sharing how vulnerable she was. So that's it. I'm gonna take a break and then come back and talk to you about PTSD and sexual abuse and DID, dissociative identity disorders, which is very fascinating. Yeah, so take care.